Many of you have been enjoying the ABC series First Footprints, all about how people arrived and thrived on this continent thousands of years ago. It was in part inspired by the work of Canberra historian Bill Gammage. His book is called The Biggest Estate on Earth. It reveals the complex countrywide systems of land management used by Aboriginal people in pre-settlement Australia. Europeans commented that the landscapes often look like parks and grassy lawns, areas now returned to trees and wilderness. When the book was released, Craig Allen spoke to Bill Gammage about his research and in particular how it relates to the Canberra landscape.
At the time Europeans arrived, Aborigines were consciously and deliberately distributing the grass and the scrub and the trees into patterns. And they were doing that to ensure that grass and trees and scrub flourished, and also that the animals who used those flourished. And then they did it because once they'd organised those patterns, they knew where the plants would be and they knew where the animals would be, and so they could predict where to go and find them. And that meant in total they were making all life abundant, convenient to them, and predictable.
In your book you describe some of the earliest descriptions of Europeans coming to Australia. What sort of countryside did they find?
Well, the most striking thing I think is how much they talked about parks. Park would be, after bush, I think park would be the most common word they used, and clearly what struck them was the beauty of the landscape, and that too must have been deliberate. The sense of beauty that Europeans saw was obviously cultivated by Aboriginal people, and in that sense too they made Australia.
Did it really look like the gentleman's estate that you describe in the book, with paths and park areas and open areas?
Yes, it did. Not all of it, of course, because dense forest is a valuable habitat for some plants and some animals, and so are swamps. And both of those Europeans didn't think much of, so they didn't call those parts parks. But the parts that they did respond to, that's grassland and open woodland, commonly they call it parks. All over Australia, all over Tasmania, rainforests, spinifex, they're talking about parks.
When we look at some of the earliest paintings of Australia, they look overly romantic, but you're suggesting that perhaps they were more accurate than we gave them credit for.
They are accurate, or at least a large selection of them are. Of course, the conventions of the time, some of the foregrounds are quite transient, but the outlines of the hills and the nature of the vegetation is accurate, and for a good reason. Those people were the photographers of their day, and they're quite often being employed not by men brought up in the romantic or artistic traditions, but by successful squatters, successful businessmen and so on. And if they got it wrong, those blokes would say, "Hey, I paid you to paint what my land looked like, and you've mucked it up, clear out." So they have to get it right, and they commonly did. And I've got examples of that in the book.
The 200-year-old view is that Aborigines trod pretty lightly on the land, but you're suggesting a much more hands-on impact on the environment.
Yes, I'm saying they carefully managed all of it, with fire or with no fire, so that even the places that were dense forest, even places which today we might call wilderness, they consciously left that way. In other words, the whole of the country was within their mental range. They weren't chance dependent. They were deliberately organising the country. In that sense, they owned it and managed it as fully as any European has done.
And you perhaps controversially suggest that there are more trees now than there were in 1788. A lot of people might find that hard to believe.
Yeah, and of course I can only make a suggestion. I haven't actually counted them, but grass was probably the most favoured environment for grassland plants, for grassland animals, to confine dense forests, which is difficult to manage and to use as a fire break. For all those sorts of reasons, grass is very common. And of course, if you leave the country alone, what you get is not grass but trees. So they're working very hard to get rid of trees and provide grass. And it's for that sort of reason that I think there are probably more trees now than then. Differently distributed, of course. Yes, well, look how dense Black Mountain is, how many trees it's got. When Robert Hoddle first came here, that was May 1832, this was mainly grass. There was very few trees and no undergrowth. In fact, when he came, he called it Black Hill. He wrote on his survey plan Black Hill because it and O'Connor Ridge, which is the one next door, had both just been burnt or recently been burnt and had been burnt to make it grass. And look at it now. And what it does is lead you to ask the obvious question. If the trees are so dense now, why weren't they like that then? Bushfire doesn't do it. Bushfire doesn't tell you because we know that the eucalypts will survive the bushfire and they come back. It has to be repeated and regular Aboriginal fire.
So in your mind, that's a clear example of Aboriginal land management?
That's a very clear example, and there are many of them around the ACT. You've got to go a little bit further back. The first settlements here, of course, were the squatters long before Europeans arrived, and they landed on the best country around Canberra, which was Sullivan's Creek now, Duntroon, Yarralumba, and they are landing where there's good grass. Of course, what's good for kangaroos is good for cattle and sheep, so they're going to those places. They set themselves up here. Canberra is sort of squeezed in between Duntroon and Yarralumla in 1913, but basically in response to the Aboriginal landscape that was here.
And you say Aboriginal landscape quite deliberately, a landscape the Aboriginal people had created.
Yes, I don't think Australia was natural. I think it was made.